Well, I think we are live broadcasting, so I hope you've been able to get on. I cannot tell anymore who is on and who is not since I stopped using GoToMeeting. So I'm sorry if I can't recognize you and tell that you're on here, but I got the word out to the core group of you, and we'll just see how it goes from here. But I am so glad to be back with you tonight. We've been kind of missing each other for a while. I was gone part of January and just got one in January, but I am hoping to do another one next week. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I want to go ahead and get started because I know your time is valuable. I want to go ahead and get started, and let me just get this set up real quick. If you'll give me less than 30 seconds, I will be ready to go. So I don't know if you can tell it, but I love picking the titles for these because sometimes the title is the hardest part of the whole thing. So I titled this one With a Wink and a Nod. And you'll see why I titled it that here in a little bit. But let's get started with just a simple question. Have you ever asked one of your kids to explain maybe a missing cookie or their failure to do their homework or really any number of issues, only to have them tell you some version of the truth that, if it weren't dishonest, would make for some really great comedy? I know for me, with my three boys, there were times that I literally had to leave the room when they were giving me their explanations for things. Or have you ever listened to a sales rep as they told you all the benefits of a product or an opportunity, but whenever you asked for the more specific details, the story got shorter and still never answered your concerns? Well, welcome to the concept of messaging. That familiar wink, wink, nod, nod is meant to fill in all those pesky gaps and should have answered all your nagging questions, maybe even possibly making it actually true. But you and I both know that the wink, wink, and the nod, nod, they're hoping you won't notice the missing pieces and that you'll just focus on their message. I've been thinking about this for a while because it seems to me that messaging has pretty well taken over our lives. And unfortunately, in a number of situations, it's actually filtered down into some of the most private and important decisions that we make. In some cases, it has taken us personally and as a society into places we never dreamed we would go. Messaging has accomplished a lot over the last few decades. Maybe it didn't seem like it was all that powerful or effective at the time, but when you stand and you look back and see how far we've moved, my gosh, it really was very effective. The truth is, some people and some groups of people are much better at messaging than others are, and frankly, it shows. But you see, messaging isn't new. In fact, crafting the message, tweaking the message, and then hoping you won't notice those subtle changes to the truth has been around from the beginning. But even today, using carefully designed messaging to set the basis of a discussion only works if people stop thinking for themselves. If people stop looking directly at the subject with clear-eyed thought. If they stop looking at what is right in front of them, sometimes written in black and white. Because you see, masterful messaging only works effectively if you can get people to check their brains at the door. I want you to look at a modern use of messaging just so you can see an example of what I'm referring to. Have you ever really listened to primetime TV prescription drug advertising, i.e. messaging? Have you noticed that the ads don't just talk about the benefits of that particular product anymore like they used to? Oh, sure, the ad begins with all those benefits. But have you noticed that they are hoping once you're convinced that the benefits fit your need, maybe, just maybe, you won't notice the second half of the ad? where the list of multiple side effects are then told. Sometimes I stop and listen to those ads and I cringe at the thought of ever having to need their product, simply because I'm that person that'll remember that list of frankly scary side effects. Or sometimes they'll read the side effects so fast that no one could possibly understand them. So that messaging is presented in a way that you're fed the benefits before and after the possible problems. That's got a particular name. It's called the sandwich effect. Good, could kill you. Good. We're going to look at some other examples of how messaging can create an effective turning point in the discussion of important topics. And so I want to say to you right up front that my reason for using these examples, the examples I've chosen, is not to get you to think like I do. Actually, not at all. But instead to get you to think, period. Because for years I've noticed that if you want to move a discussion in a particular direction, you must control the messaging. You must be disciplined and consistent with your message. You can't afford to get sloppy with it. And as you'll soon see, this is also true with the gospel. We just simply cannot afford to get careless with this message of unshackled grace. And I'll show you this in the scriptures very clearly as we go along. But first, we have to consider how far removed from simple truth our culture has moved. And it's been moved by someone having mastered the messaging. Sometimes, something else I've noticed is that in our society today, it seems like truth isn't enough anymore. Truth without a crafted messaging has been replaced by variations of the truth that are masterfully messaged. I know this sounds like a little bit of walking around in circles, but you stay with me because there's a very important point that you and I need to take a look at. Give it some consideration. What used to be right in front of your eyes, plain truth, has been remessaged as some modern form of the original thing. One of the things I watch really carefully is when Hollywood, for instance, calls something modern. Because I have noticed, I am 66 years old, I've had a little bit of time to watch these repeat patterns, and I have noticed that most of the time, when Hollywood calls something modern, it's their subtle introduction of a variation of something we used to call normal. But if you take a good look, you'll notice that the message is meant to update you from an old normal to their modern normal. They don't refer to their new version as altered or abnormal, but they refer to it as modern. So it's actually the word modern is the messaging. Everything that follows that word is meant to update your thinking so that what they are presenting as modern and updated becomes normal to you. You could put any subject after that word modern, and this form of messaging that Hollywood uses so effectively would apply. The consequence is if you and I don't exercise plain truth, simple truth thinking, if you and I don't look at it with clear eyes, you will in fact over time accept their update without anyone ever having to argue with you. The message itself will find its way into your normal way of thinking, and you will soon think of what they presented as modern, eventually as normal. Your thought process will have changed because of messaging, even though what is right in front of your eyes is not true, and it's not normal, and it's not clear-eyed thinking. You likely had to abandon what is right in front of you in order to accept their new normal. Remember we said earlier that this controlled messaging has been around from the beginning, that it isn't new. Now, just to put you at ease, because I suspect that some of you, or somebody who might in the future see this video, might feel uncomfortable at this point that I might take these wonderful stories of grace and somehow turn them into some soapbox speech. Please. I'm going to ask you to hang in there with me for a few minutes, and you'll see that my purpose for even mentioning these very public issues isn't actually about the issues themselves, but about the powerful use of messaging as an alternative to plain and simple truth. I believe that you'll see as we go along that religion has its own problems with maintaining simple truth, that messaging is also used in most forms of religion. From the very beginning of man's experience with God, simple truth has been tweaked by messaging. I'm sure you know where I'm going to ask you to go with me now at this point, and so I have to ask you one more time to go back with me to the very beginning, because again, the art of messaging is not new. Because if you can control the message, eventually you can control the result. So here we go, one more time. In the beginning, back there in the beginning, Genesis chapter 2, it says that God made man. Listen real carefully to this. God made man in his own image and likeness. Oh, that's written right in front of you in black and white. Correct? He made him that way. God was the one who set man's normal, and he started him out that way. So I think I'm safe to say that we might agree that man's normal in the beginning was in the image of God and after his likeness. Okay? Can we agree right here that in black and white, God started him out that way? So think about this. If you're having a hard time accepting that you are created in the image and likeness of God, it might actually be your best example yet of the effectiveness of messaging because it worked on you. If you think of yourself as anything less than in the image and likeness of God, you bought the messaging. But as you well know, something happened to that simple, plain truth. God made, so let's rehearse it one more time. God made a garden full of good things for man. And then he made man and he put him in that garden filled with goodness and gave him free access to it. That man could eat of anything without cost to him. He could eat as much as he wanted without any limits on him. He had complete access to every single thing except one, the knowledge of good and evil. Been there, talked about that before, but we got to put it in here because goodness was all around him. Goodness was all available to him. God took lots of time to get goodness ready for him. Then he opened wide the door, put him in there, made him in his own image and likeness, put him in that garden and said, have at it. This is yours, enjoy. Squeal in delight. But he told him there's only one thing. There's only one thing you can't have access to, not without bad results. He was told very sternly, very clearly, do not partake of the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil, because that is what will kill you. Plain and clear. Anyone who heard it would have said, got it. That's pretty clear. Knowledge of good and evil is clearly what will end in you're dead. The truth that knowledge of good and knowledge of evil will kill you is one of the normals. That would be an absolute plain reality that God set in place. And that simple truth holds true all the way throughout the scriptures. Over and over, we'll see it lived out as true. That is, unless we bought the tweak of the messaging. Now, part of the reason why we are looking at this subject is that many of the shackles that restrict and restrain grace in our life are there because of messaging. What God has said is normal has been brought into question by some form of messaging. And we must address that messaging, even in religion, if we're going to get the shackles off of grace. So let's go back to the beginning again. You know how it happened. Before long, a messenger came along and altered the simple message by saying, no, 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 this knowledge isn't deadly. No, instead, it's forbidden. And it's forbidden because it holds something for you that will make you like God. Oops, weren't they already made in his image and likeness? Wasn't that already what God set as their normal? Then the messenger added, no, 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 it's forbidden because your eyes will be open. Really? Did you notice anybody ever saying that their eyes were closed? You know, I've often wondered why Eve didn't suspect the messenger. So often we ignore the plain reality of the messenger's credibility. It's usually because the message itself has something in it appealing. This happens in sales a lot. Have you ever had a salesperson kind of make you feel funny, a little bit creepy about them? But because they were telling you what you wanted to hear about a product or an opportunity, you ignored your misgivings about the messenger. I know you've probably experienced that. I've experienced it a lot. I used to be Biff's kind of little, what'd you call it? I would see my little flag up there. I just go, I don't feel right about this. Well, I tried something one time when I was out shopping for a new car. My company was going to pay for the car, so I had a fairly high budget for it and had plenty of time to make my choice. So I decided before I went to look that two things were going to matter to me: how it drove and rode, but not what was under the hood. And secondly, it mattered to me if the salesperson drove that brand for a personal car themselves. So I started out and went out to test drive 9 different brands. If the salesperson started talking to me about what was under the hood, I gently but very clearly told them immediately that it didn't matter to me. And I would not be making my decision based on that. If they continued on anyway, I graciously found my way out the door because they weren't listening to me. You see, my husband was the one who knew all about what was under the hood. But I was the one who was going to drive it. So how it drove and how it rode was how I was going to decide. And I also asked each salesperson if they drove the same brand. It didn't matter to me what year it was or what model of that brand, but just that they were driving the same brand. And most of them did not. That made me wonder a bit about their sales pitch, no matter how impressive their message was. Well, I finally settled on a Lexus for both of the above reasons. It rode amazing, it drove fabulous, and the salesman drove one himself, even though it was actually quite an old one. But that just reassured me that they last a long time. All of this to say, I wasn't just looking for a sales pitch that day or a sales message, but an honest review that would help me make a very important decision. And it did. I still have that car today, and it runs like the day I bought it. I have proven the truth of that salesman's message over and over by daily and yearly driving. In fact, I just drove it to Washington, D.C. in January, all the way up there and all the way back, and it drove like the day I bought it. Messaging many times can take us in a direction where we accept things we would not normally accept. That is why we have to talk about it. I think you'll probably agree with me that the gospel is the most important and the most precious and the most effective life-changing message given to man since the beginning. In fact, the gospel actually means good news or good message. The actual word used to describe the gospel also has this meaning, and I hope you'll write this down, because this is one of those understandings of a word that just change things on the inside. And they make the scriptures actually make sense to themselves, all the way from the beginning, all the way through. Here's what it is. The actual word used to describe the gospel also means, quote unquote, divine assurance of goodness, a promise and a pledge. Really? Oh, That sounds like what God prepared for Adam in the beginning, a garden full of goodness and open access to it. I want you to remember this divine assurance of goodness as we look at preserving this good message, preserving it clearly defined, undiluted, unaltered. It is so absolutely essential for us to keep the message of this divine assurance of good. If the message is tweaked or modernized in ways that change its fundamental truth, it will also undermine the faith of those who hold it as truth. It's just impossible not to. So what I want to do with you is look at this good message, this good news, this divine assurance of goodness, the gospel. I want to look with you at the gospel, which is grace. I want us to look with clear-eyed thinking. Now, it might mean that sometimes we have to ignore the tug of tradition at first. Maybe, maybe not. But I'm sure that once we clearly see the gospel for what it is, we'll be more than willing to leave tradition or religion that contradicts it by the wayside. I know for a fact I do, and I assume you do too, want to live the reality of this divine assurance of goodness and live it with eyes wide open, not with any shadows of doubt lingering in the corner. There's another powerful form of messaging, music. Music is such a powerful delivery system. But every form of messaging goes through changes, sometimes from decade to decade, and music is one of those, and Christian music as well. The messaging of Christian music has changed from, let's say, the works of the Simpson Brothers and from songs like Amazing Grace, and in some cases to current versions of these traditional works. Now, I want to make very clear to you that I'm not at all opposed to new musical versions of what a lot of people refer to as sacred hymns. In fact, I actually really love some of them. There's one of them on the radio right now that stops me cold in my tracks every time I hear it. It's a song that weaves a new song with the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul. And every time I hear it, oh my gosh, it just bathes my soul. Many times I stop and listen very carefully to any new version of a traditional work because I want to know if the message has been changed as well, not just the musical version. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I was recently in my son's church on Christmas Eve for their service, and as we sang the song, Joy to the World, I carefully listened to every word of that familiar traditional Christmas song. Here it is. You'll recognize this. Joy to the world, the Lord is come. Let earth receive her King. Let every heart prepare him room, and heaven and nature sing, and heaven and nature sing. Let heaven and nature sing. Listen to the next verse. Oh my gosh. He rules the world. Ready for it? With a rod of iron. No. He rules the world with truth and grace, and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness and the wonders of his love. Oh my gosh. He rules the world with truth and grace and makes the nations prove. That means give testament to the glories of his righteousness and the wonders of his love. Wow. I got to tell you, as we sang, the musical version of this song that night was loud. I mean, it was rambunctious. And it was obvious that some people in that room were clearly uncomfortable with the music as we started out. Oh my gosh, the truth of that unaltered message was so effective. I kid you not, by the end of that song, most of the hands and hearts in that entire room were lifted in praise and glory to the Prince of Peace and the Lord of Lords, regardless of the rambunctious music. By the end of that song, the place was absolutely on fire. It was such an amazing experience. Just to experience how simple truth overruled people's preferences of music. It was one of the loudest musical times I've been in that church. But the simple truth of joy to the world, he rules the world with truth, and Christ broke right down every barrier. That's what I'm talking about. You know, I've listened to Christian music for decades, but I have to tell you a secret. There have been times I really actually preferred to turn the station to 60s and 70s pop music because the messaging in Christian music wasn't ringing true to me anymore. I went through a period of time there that I didn't listen to it at all. It wasn't about the gospel anymore. It certainly wasn't about good news anymore. In fact, there was hardly any good news in it. So I just left Christian music completely for a while. But then as artists themselves began to once again live the truth of grace and write the truth of grace and sing the truth of God's grace, I fell in love with it all over again, because there's nothing that can move you like a well-crafted piece of music that has the truth, the simple truth of the gospel in it. Oh my gosh, it can just tear down all kinds of things inside you. Now, I have many, many favorites that I sing out loud, full volume, whenever I hear them. I try not to sing out loud in stores like Hobby Lobby where they play Christian music throughout the store. But the point here is you can never, ever stop paying attention to the messaging because it changes things. Sometimes towards the truth, other times away from it in very subtle, seemingly unimportant ways. Never, ever check your brain at the door. Never. I told you we're going to look at how the message of the good news is clearly explained and then clearly contrasted to what it replaced. And we'll start with one of the most basic letters that the Apostle Paul wrote. It's his letter to the Romans. We're going to watch him make the case for the gospel, the good news, as he explains it to them. Now, you've got to remember that the Romans were not under or obligated to the law of Moses or any of the additional laws that governed Israel. Newsflash, neither were you under the law of Moses and its additions, unless your DNA said so. The law of Moses and its additional laws were given to the family of Abraham when they decided that God doing for them was no longer necessary. So he's writing to the Romans, who are Gentiles, and they were not under the law. But what was happening was they were being told by other Jewish believers that they should keep parts of the law in addition to receiving the good news, the gospel, the divine assurance of goodness. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? The idea to say yes, but also is really a subtle way of saying that the truth of the gospel, the truth of Calvary, as the most profound seismic shift in human history, it's a subtle way of saying that the truth of Calvary, that Calvary will change any heart from any nation, in any language, from any background, and change them from sinner to the redeemed, from the slave to the freeborn, from captive to liberated. I hope you can see that yes, and also is a subtle way that says this simple truth just isn't quite enough on its own. Now, no one is ever going to say outright that Calvary isn't enough, but they will say yes, and also. And the messaging changes the very fundamental truth of the good news. Here's why. Because that messaging shifts your thinking from what he did to you need to do. It subtly insists that you need the knowledge of good. In this case, your sons ought to be circumcised, so you can be sure to keep that. That's good. Keep that. And you need a little knowledge of evil. In this case, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. So you can certainly avoid doing that is wrong. Sounds simple, sounds harmless, but what it does is it inserts a cloud between the freedom in your heart and the plain, black and white, simple truth that what he did is the only good news you need, and that his divine assurance of goodness is your only place of rest. How can I tell you? Paul almost pops a cork with the Galatians over this exact very thing. They had received the good news, and then believers from Jerusalem had come in and added just a few little subtle additions, seemingly harmless additions. But that sent Paul into complete damage control on steroids. And he asked the Galatians this: who has bewitched you? Who's been messing with your simplicity? Now, no one was casting visible spells over the Galatian believers. So what had Paul so concerned that he warned them about losing everything that Calvary provided? Here's what had Paul on full alert. It was the tweaking of the simple message that grace cannot be earned and that it needs nothing added. When you add doing to receiving, you change the character of the covenant itself. And so he minced no words with them. The simple good news is that the same Calvary that shook the earth and rallied heaven to its feet is also profoundly powerful enough to keep you from falling as you walk daily in this amazing grace. I'm going to prove that to you. I'm going to say that one again. The simple good news is that the same Calvary that shook the earth and rallied all of heaven to its feet is profoundly powerful enough to keep you, Julie Tan, and you, Tammy, and you, Linda, and you, Barbara, from falling as you walk in this amazing grace daily. Jude says that very same thing in clear, black on white words. Here's what Jude says: that it is God himself who is able to keep you. That means to be on guard. It is God himself who is able to keep you, to be on guard for you, to keep you from falling. That word falling means without sin. Oh, yeah. That it is God himself who's tasked to be on guard to keep you without sin and to preserve you without sin and present you faultless, blameless, and guiltless. Ah. It's God himself. How much more relaxed and restful will your life be when you actually believe that? That Calvary doesn't need yes and. Doesn't need it. It seems so difficult for some people in Christianity to keep the good news this simple. That it isn't you, but rather God, who is the only one not only able to, but is the one tasked with keeping you and presenting you without sin. I'm just going to tell you that it's one of the deviations I listen for in Christian music. Here's what I call it. I call it sin consciousness. Because you see, sin consciousness is not a mark of the good news, the gospel. In fact, it is the hallmark of the law. Let me say that again. Sin consciousness is not a mark of the gospel. It is the hallmark of the law. Romans chapter 3 tells us that very clearly. It says that the very point, the very purpose of the law was to bring you to a guilty sin consciousness before God. Go read it for yourself. I'm not making this up. It's interesting that some people mistakenly think that grace was given, yes, to ransom us from our sins, but then also to enable us to keep the law better, to be better at performing the do's and don'ts of the law. Really? This is exactly what Paul wanted to make sure the Romans understood was not true. They were being told by other believers, yes, Jesus died and rose for your sins, but also you should add some simple parts of the law like avoiding meats, sacrifice to idols, and possibly consider circumcising your sons. Now, I keep using those same two because they're so obvious. The problem is that this is not the message of the gospel. This isn't in keeping with the message of divine assurance of goodness. It isn't, not at all. Adding things contained in the law, no matter how small and harmless they seem, changes the message at its very foundation. Paul is quite strong here in his teaching on this in Romans 3. He says it this way. Okay, now I want you to pay close attention to this because it also can help you answer those who ask the question, well, if you don't have the law, what will restrain and hold you in check if you don't have the law? So here it is. Listen to this because this is a really good answer. Here it is. Romans chapter 3. It says, quote unquote, whatever the law has to say, it says it to those who are under it, obligated to it. But that isn't you because you are not under the law, you're under grace. If you're not under the law has no conversation with you. There should be no dialogue between you and the law. It has nothing to say to you because you're not under it. And then he goes on to say further in Romans 3:19 to say that the goal of the law was to make everyone guilty before God. But wait a minute, I thought the goal of the law was to teach me how to walk uprightly. No. The goal of the law was to remind you that you're guilty, to keep you sin-focused. But the point of the gospel is to justify you, to make you blameless and guiltless without doing anything except receiving it. Now, I know some of you might have a hard time with this at this particular moment. Because like me, you've worked so hard so many years of your life to keep the law and to stay within the framework that the law has defined for you. And so it's pretty easy when you start coming into understanding grace to feel like you wasted a lot of time. Well, welcome to the club. But it's okay. It's okay. You're not out of time. You didn't lose all the valuable time. No. You know, Jesus accomplished in the last 10% of his life what radically changed the world. So you've got plenty of time to enjoy this life in grace. Don't even focus on it. Make the change and you'll discover that the borders of restraint come off of your soul. And you can begin to experience what the gospel is really all about. And as you do, your impact to those around you will be phenomenal. You won't have to work at having an impact. You are the impact. Changed you. Liberated you. Paul fully exposes that by doing or keeping the law, no one, not even the best of us, can be justified by it. Because it's not the point of the law. It's not what the law was for. Paul's writings, you'll see also that what he means by the law includes the original law of Moses plus all the additions. And they got to be quite a few, by the way. But it's really the last sentence of Romans chapter 3, verse 20, where Paul just drops this bombshell. I call it a truth bomb. Are you ready for this? Well, I kind of suggest you hang on to your chair or something else very solid because this is simple black words on white paper, plain truth. This is a truth bomb that will rattle your core if you aren't ready for it. It's not some man's version of the truth, and it's probably not going to be easy for some people to receive this truth right away because of the messaging they've heard most of their lives. It has become their normal, but it's still the truth. Paul's message of the good news is a very different message than the message given by the law. The law's message had become normal. That's what was normal. And to many Christians, it is their normal also. It's all about guilt and condemnation. But guess what? The message changed when the covenant changed. And I would just challenge you to be very careful that the messaging you pattern your life and your faith after is the one that changed when the covenant changed. We'll get back to Romans 3:20 in just a minute. But to illustrate this, and to illustrate the need to keep the messages distinctly clear, Jesus in each of the Gospels uses an interesting illustration to tell us how useless and how hazardous it is to mix the law with the gospel. Now, he doesn't say it that way. He's talking about the old and new covenants, but the old covenant is the law, and the new covenant is grace. So to mix the old covenant that was unable to redeem and perfect man with the new covenant that both redeems and makes him righteous and keeps him faultless. You would think that we would be able to easily see that the two of those are not compatible. And yet we keep trying to force the two of them together and somehow or another work our life and our faith around the two of them. And he uses an example of how you can't do that. And so in the new covenant, you are faultless because this covenant, the new covenant, doesn't define you by what you do. So Jesus says it this way in each of the Gospels. He says, you cannot put new wine into old wineskins. And if you do, the skin will break and you'll lose the benefits of both. If you try to mix keeping the law with righteousness that is based solely on believing, you'll actually find that neither one will benefit you. You'll lose both. Sounds familiar? It's just like man, Adam did back in Genesis. He tried to mix doing something extra to be like God when God had already made him that way. And as a result, he lost everything. He forfeited it all in pursuit of making himself more like God, who had already made him in his own image and likeness. When will we learn? The change of the covenant and the change of the messaging is so important for you and I to get. You see, in Romans 3:20, I'm going to say 3:20b because it's the last part of that verse. It says something really clearly, and it's what I said you might need to hang on to your chair for. For some of you, it won't register right now as a truth bomb yet. Some of you will fall off your chair today, but some of you, it'll be a few weeks when it finally hits you, and when it does, then you'll fall off your chair. I'm being facetious here. Here it is. Quote, because of the law came the knowledge of sin. Oh, that's probably not what you were expecting to hear, was it? The law keeps you sin conscious. Consciousness of sin in your daily life is an indication that the law is still messaging you. It's what the law does. It's the law's job to keep you conscious of sin. It keeps you on guard to keep yourself from sin and keeps you guilty if you do sin. On edge and on guard. But wait a minute. Jude clearly says that it's God who's on guard to keep you from falling, to keep you from sin. The law tries to convince you daily that that's your job. But the gospel is not sin conscious. In fact, God spent Jesus to remedy the issue of sin so that you could live in a righteousness that isn't connected to what you do at all, but instead connects you to him that you know and to what he did. Wow. Try living with no consciousness of sin for a day. No sin consciousness? Just imagine the space that would free up in your mind, making room for lots of new creativity and inspiration. Only the gospel of grace can clear your conscience of sin. Hebrews chapter 10 is clear on this. In fact, it says that the law had to be replaced because it couldn't free the conscience of sin. This is simple, but it's a profoundly clear passage in Romans 3. And eventually it brings us to a very famous element of the Roman road to salvation. I don't know how many of you have heard, if you've been around certain Christian circles, you know the Roman road to salvation. And it usually ends, included in the Roman road to salvation is this very familiar passage, Romans 3:23. However, it's normally used as a bit of a billy club, a 2x4. And it says this, quote, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." He wasn't using it as a billy club. He was finishing a train of thought saying, it's just a reality. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. No one, not the Jew who kept the deeds of the law, even perfectly, or the Gentile who was never under the law, can justify himself by doing one thing or by doing a whole lot of things. No, only a Redeemer can do that. And he did. Because all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And then Galatians chapter 3 says to us that Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. I remember the first time I read that and I actually believed what I was reading on black and white paper. It was like, Jeannie, did you know that the law was and is a curse to you? Here's a word that's included in the definition of the word curse, and it means to doom you. Why do we have such a hard time giving this up? Did you know that the law was and is a curse to you and that it dooms you? The law that some people want to post on their front yard, or they want it out in the public square, is a message of doom and condemnation. Listen, I have no problem with putting messages in the public square, but please, let's don't put doom and destruction there, because that covenant's gone and the message is over and there's a new covenant and it's got a different message. Here's the message. You want to put this one? If you want to put something in a public square, put this one or something like it. God loved you before you ever knew his name, and he spent his most valued son to rescue you. You see, religion sends the message that the law is there for your good and that it keeps you on the right path and it defines the border of godly behavior for you. But the message of the gospel is that you have been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb from sin and from the curse and doom of the law. And that righteousness is now measured by what was done by the Lamb slain and not by what is done by you. The message of the good news is that the miraculous power of God is able to keep you from falling, i.e., without sin, and to present you faultless and guiltless. I gotta ask you, can you see the difference in those messaging? Can you see how easy it is to slip back into doing in order to receive? Dear Jesus, I hope so. I hope so. I hope so. Because messaging works. It kind of gets down in there and defines itself as normal. And God is in the process of re-educating our normal. Just imagine living with the clear-eyed truth of this amazing grace as your normal. Whew. I keep telling everybody, I pray over them. I just say, God, I want you to make them squeal in delight. I've got a friend up in South Carolina, and she's pretty much mastered the squeal. I mean, she's really pretty good at it. I told you earlier that messaging has become an art form in our society. It's been used as a subtle re-education to move society from things that are in plain sight, normal thinking, to modern versions aren't normal at all. And the use of messaging is slow and subtle, but long term, it is so effective. And religious messaging that refuses to rest in the simplicity of Calvary, but instead insists on complicating faith and suggests that to walk in Christ involves more than simply walking in Him the same way in which you received Him, is equally damaging. Actually, in my view, it's more damaging because it taints your faith. And in the words of the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 3, it bewitches you into thinking that you can finish by doing what you started by receiving. You didn't qualify to receive Christ by doing something and working something. And you cannot walk in Him successfully by doing and working. Walk in Him in the same manner in which you received Him, because of His grace and through His faith. Okay. The shackles on grace are quickly snapped off. Once a believer hears the truth and receives it, there's no sweat, no toil, no long seasons of sowing good works in order to reap rich rewards of peace. Nope. It's simply to hear and receive. The message, the divine assurance of goodness, takes over, and it transforms your life by transforming your mind. There is such a clear, simple, profound trumpet sounding right now. It's kind of like in ancient times when there was a battle raging. The noise of the battle just filled the air. It was the trumpet that sounded that would pierce through the noise of the battle, surrounding a soldier, and give that soldier a clear, certain, confident message. Tell you what, only a clear trumpet sound would work. Only a clear, piercing message can give you confident assurance when life is so very noisy. When hope feels lost, when wounds feel overwhelming, only a clear message will waken your soul that is tired. It will stir up faith that feels like it's on life support. Trust me, grace is that message. And it is the clearest one ever. It will penetrate through layers of defeat. It'll penetrate through stone walls of fear. It'll penetrate through barriers put up by religion, and it will awaken your heart to hope. Hope that's found where love has spread out its message into every corner of your heart, as it reminds you and tells you and re-educates you. And He loved you before you ever knew His name. He dispensed His love to you while you were still a sinner. It's a clear, simple, penetrating message. No more wink, wink, nod, nod. I hope you don't know this. No. Snap, snap. Grace works in you. It frees you up. It restores you. It re-educates you. And then grace itself keeps you from sin and presents you guiltless and faultless. Oh my word, this really is amazing grace. I love being with you. I can't wait till the next time we're together, which I actually think might be this next week, when I'll be talking about location. Also, just for a point of reference, I am updating my Kindle book, Unshackled Grace, next week. So if you have it already, I believe you can get the updated version. If you don't have it yet, I invite you to get it and share this message of divine assurance of goodness. And let's together turn this world right side up. Have a great evening. Thank you so much for taking your time to be with me. I'll tell you what, I appreciate it very much.